In the summer of 2023, a fleet manager in Phoenix walked into a problem that didn't make sense on the surface. It's nearly 50 service trucks, all running perfectly, all maintained on schedule, had aged overnight, or so it seemed. The black plastic trim had faded into a dull, lifeless gray. Not chipped, not broken, just worn out by nothing more than sunlight. The quote to restore them cosmetically came back at over $10,000. For trucks that still did their job flawlessly, that number felt absurd. So he did what people have done for centuries when faced with a system that doesn't add up. He looked for an alternative, a cheap one, a simple one. And what he found was almost offensive in its simplicity. A bottle of mineral oil, the kind you can buy at a pharmacy for next to nothing, restored those panels in minutes. Not slightly improved, fully restored in appearance. Rich black factory finish, like the damage had never happened. That moment is where this stops being about car care and starts becoming something far more interesting. Because when a $1 solution competes with a 5-figure quote, it forces a deeper question. Is this just a clever trick? Or are we looking at a pattern that has existed for far longer than modern vehicles? Today we're going to trace that pattern. Not just how plastic fades, but why materials around us seem to fail in predictable ways. We'll move through history, into chemistry, and then back into real-world survival thinking. Because at its core, this is about understanding the lifespan of the tools you depend on. And once you understand that, you stop reacting to problems and start staying ahead of them. If you go back to vehicles built before the late 1960s, you'll notice something immediately. The exposed components, bumpers, trims, handles, weren't made of lightweight polymers. They were metal, steel, aluminum, chrome-plated surfaces. These weren't perfect materials, but they behaved predictably. They rusted under certain conditions, they pitted with neglect, but they didn't quietly degrade under sunlight alone. A chrome bumper from the 1950s could still hold its appearance decades later with basic maintenance. It's not because it was magical, but because the material itself didn't carry an invisible timer tied to UV exposure. Longevity was baked into the physical properties. That mindset reflected something broader. Tools were expected to last. Ownership implied maintenance, and maintenance extended lifespan. There was a direct relationship between care and durability, but that relationship began to shift. Not because engineers forgot how to build durable materials, but because the economic landscape changed. During the early 20th century, particularly around the economic strain of the Great Depression, industries faced a difficult reality. If products lasted too long, demand slowed. Manufacturing could outpace consumption. And that imbalance created pressure not to improve durability, but to manage it. The idea that followed was simple and powerful. If products had a predictable lifespan, demand could be stabilized, not through failure alone, but through cycles, replacement, upgrade, renewal. This thinking didn't stay theoretical. It became embedded in real industrial practices. One of the most documented examples involved light bulb manufacturers coordinating to standardize lifespan limits. It's not because they couldn't produce longer-lasting bulbs, but because consistency in replacement created stability in sales. At the same time, industries like automotive manufacturing introduced another layer. Not physical wear, but psychological aging. Styling changed frequently, not to improve function, but to make previous versions feel outdated. By the time plastics began replacing metals and visible components, this mindset was already in place, and that's where things get interesting. When regulations in the 1970s began emphasizing safety and fuel efficiency, manufacturers needed materials that could absorb impact, reduce weight, and be produced at scale. Thermoplastics, particularly polypropylene, fit that need perfectly. They were lighter than metal, easier to mold into complex shapes, and cost-effective in mass production. From a design standpoint, it was a breakthrough. But the trade-off wasn't hidden. It was known. Polypropylene, in its raw form, is highly vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation. Under continuous sun exposure, its molecular structure begins to break down. Not gradually in a way you can easily track, but consistently, predictably, and irreversibly. Engineers understood this. Stabilizers were developed to slow the process. But stabilizers add cost, and in large-scale manufacturing, even small cost increases multiply quickly. So what you get isn't a conspiracy, it's something more subtle. Materials are engineered to meet requirements, not exceed them unnecessarily. If a component can perform adequately for several years under normal conditions, that becomes the baseline. Longevity beyond that is often optional, not prioritized. And that's how you end up with a material that performs beautifully at first, and then slowly loses its integrity under something as constant as sunlight. At the microscopic level, automotive plastics are made of long chains of molecules, strong, flexible, interconnected. That structure is what gives the material its durability and resilience. When ultraviolet radiation hits the surface, it introduces energy strong enough to break those molecular bonds. Once broken, those fragments react with oxygen in the air, triggering a chain reaction known as photooxidation. This process doesn't just weaken the material, it changes its surface entirely. The once smooth exterior becomes rough on a microscopic scale. Tiny cracks form. The structure becomes porous. Now here's the critical detail. The deep black color in automotive trim comes from carbon-based pigments embedded within the plastic. In a healthy structure, light is absorbed cleanly, giving that rich appearance. But once the surface degrades, light no longer behaves the same way. Instead of being absorbed, it scatters across those microfractures. Scattering is what your eyes interpret as fading. So the gray, chalky look isn't just cosmetic. It's evidence of structural breakdown. When mineral oil is applied to that damaged surface, something very specific happens. The oil seeps into those microscopic cracks and pores, filling the gaps left behind by degradation. Here's where physics comes in. Mineral oil and the original plastic have very similar optical properties. When the oil fills those spaces, it reduces the scattering of light. Instead of bouncing unpredictably, light travels more smoothly across the surface and reaches the pigment beneath. The result is immediate. The black color appears restored, but it's important to understand what's actually happening. The structure hasn't healed. The broken molecular chains remain broken. The oil is simply changing how light interacts with the damaged surface. That's why the effect can last, because the oil is embedded within the material, but also why it's not permanent. Over time, exposure to the elements will reduce its presence, and the appearance will fade again. Using mineral oil casually can create problems if you don't understand how it interacts with different materials. Rubber components, particularly those used in seals and gaskets, can absorb oils and swell over time. This changes their shape and flexibility, eventually leading to failure. Water leaks, compromised seals, and long-term damage can follow. Switching to natural oils isn't a safe workaround either. Many plant-based oils degrade under heat and sunlight, becoming sticky and unstable. Instead of protecting the surface, they accelerate grime buildup and deterioration. There's also the issue of structural plastics. Certain materials can experience stress-related cracking when exposed to oils over extended periods. It's not immediate, but over time it weakens the integrity of the component. So while the method works, it requires precision. It's a tool, not a universal solution. There isn't a single perfect fix because the problem itself isn't simple. It's the result of material choice, environmental exposure, and time. Some treatments are designed to protect rather than restore. They add a layer of resistance against UV radiation, slowing the degradation process. They require maintenance, but they're safe and predictable. Other methods attempt restoration but come with trade-offs. High heat, for example, can temporarily improve appearance by altering the surface, but it depletes the material's remaining resilience. More advanced solutions involve coatings that bond with the surface and provide longer-term protection. These work best when applied early, before deep damage occurs. The pattern here is consistent with survival principles throughout history. Prevention is always more effective than repair. What happened to that fleet of trucks wasn't unusual, it was predictable. Materials behaved exactly as they were designed to behave under prolonged exposure. The low-cost solution worked because it exploited a physical property, not because it reversed damage. And that's the key takeaway. Throughout history, the individuals who managed resources best weren't the ones with access to the most tools. They were the ones who understood how those tools behaved over time. From builders choosing wood that resisted decay, to craftsmen adjusting materials based on climate, to mechanics anticipating wear before failure, success came from understanding, not reaction. That principle hasn't changed. Materials are different, but the pattern is the same. This isn't just about plastic trim. It's about recognizing how modern materials are optimized. Not for maximum lifespan, but for efficiency, cost, and acceptable durability. Once you understand that, you stop being surprised when things degrade. More importantly, you start taking control of that process. You protect surfaces before they fail. You choose treatments based on compatibility, not popularity. You recognize when a solution is cosmetic versus structural. That shift from reacting to understanding is what defines real self-reliance. If there's one thing to carry forward, it's this. There is no shortcut that replaces knowledge. Quick fixes can be useful, but only when you understand their limits. The system isn't built against you, but it's not built to maximize longevity either. It's built for balance, and that balance often leaves room for failure over time. Your advantage comes from seeing that clearly. If this breakdown gave you a new way to look at everyday materials, make sure you subscribe and stay with the channel. Share this with someone who still thinks replacement is the only option. Because once you understand how things actually work, you stop wasting money. You start extending the life of everything you depend on. And that's where real survival thinking begins.